Okay, if we could begin. Welcome to the Meet the Author series. This is the sixth and unfortunately the last week of the series. Our authors today are Paulette Boudrot over here and Christina Lowry over here, who's written this book. She's a translator. She will tell you about her book. Christy Lawrence could not be here today. I'm pitching in for her. My name is Terry Arthur, and I am the author of Fatal Decision, Edith Cavell, World War Nurse, and Fatal Destiny of the same title. I'll tell you a little bit about the Sandwich Alliance for the Arts. Was formed in 2015 and is a component of 4 groups that meet monthly. It comprises of visual arts, literary arts, performing arts, and the Friends of Arts. We have regular meetings, and the times are under the events on our Facebook page. Membership is open to all artists and friends, and our goal is to identify all local artists and create a resource database of artists in order to provide artists and more exposure and opportunities for them. I'd like to introduce Paulette Boudrot to start off with. Miss Boudrot was raised in Fall River, Massachusetts, when French was spoken in the community by her parents, and I know this because I grew up in Fall River also, and in Fall River in those days you were either French or you were Portuguese. She earned a BS in education from Bridgewater State University, an MA in French language and literature from Middlebury College in Vermont, and a diploma in the 20th century French literature from the Sorbonne University of Paris. She taught French and ESL in elementary schools, colleges, and universities throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island. During the 1980s, she transitioned from education to administration of French cultural sciences at the French consulate in Boston, and then she moved on to other administrative positions in the Boston-Cambridge area. In 1995, she founded the PLJ Administrative and Business Solutions, a company outsourcing administration and project management for small to medium-sized companies, and association management to professional and nonprofit organizations. In her retirement, she attended the first Bread Loaf Transition Conference in Vermont, Boston. My Blissful Writer is her debut translation. She is active in Rotary International and currently lives on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Her daughter is the author, she is the translator, and she will introduce her daughter. Ms. Boudrot.
Thank you. So today I'm wearing 2 hats. Just imagine going back maybe 35 years, and I'll be my daughter. My daughter is the author, Alison McLennan, and I'm the translator, Paulette Boudrot. And what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about my daughter's books. They're historical novels, so I'll talk about the books and also talk a little bit about facts and research involved in writing a historical novel, because I don't think we've talked too much about that in this series. So we're going to focus on the facts and the research. And then I'll talk about my book, which is not yet published. It's being published, and it will come out early 2020. And that's Boston, My Blissful Winter, and they're over here. So a few weeks ago, I was in Ogden, Utah, helping my daughter with the release of her newest book, which is Ophelia's War, Dangerous Mercy, and helping her with her launch party. And as she stood up to address the group, the first thing she said was, I write because of my mom. I thought, uh-oh, what's she going to say now? Because I had never heard her say that before. So she continued, when I was a little girl, I liked to read in bed, but my mother would come upstairs and make me put the light out. So instead of going to sleep, I would make up stories in my head. So that surprised me because I didn't know she did that. So I'll talk first of all her first book, which is Falling for Johnny. And these are her 3 books right here. This is Falling for Johnny right here. So this is published in 2013, and it's a fictional story, and it was inspired by the Boston underworld and notorious crime boss, James Whitey Bulger. It's the story of Riley, a young teenage girl who befriends an older man she meets while walking along Carson Beach. This is Carson Beach right on the cover, in Dorchester. So the book is set in Dorchester, Quincy, and Squantum, but there's also a mention of Grand Avenue and Falmouth. So if you read the book, keep that in mind. Part 1 is about Johnny, Part 2 is about Riley, and Part 3 is about falling for Johnny. And it's followed by 4 or 5 pages of Alison's reflections and comparisons between the fictional Johnny, he's called Johnny the Camel McPherson, and the real James Whitey Bulger. So there are about 4 or 5 pages of that at the end. So facts and research. Alison says, when I started writing Falling for Johnny, James Whitey Bulger was still on the lam, and he'd fallen from the spotlight because he'd been missing for nearly 16 years. Someone mentioned him in passing, and I remembered hearing a lot about him while I was growing up in Quincy. I started researching him and realized he lived across the street from my mother's apartment building in Quincy. And his girlfriend's house, where he also spent a lot of time, was near where my father lived in Squantum. I thought Bulger would make a great character for a novel, so I borrowed most of his life story to create the character Johnny. I fabricated his relationship with the priest, and that's in the notes, and in real life, he had a son who died very young from an allergic reaction to aspirin. In Falling for Johnny, I changed the son to a daughter. Besides that, everything that happens in the novel after Johnny meets Riley is complete fiction. Bulger was apprehended on my 40th birthday in 2011, right after I finished my novel. The timing is uncanny. I wrote to him in prison, and he immediately wrote back to me. It turned out he had stopped in Ogden, Utah, where I live, when he first went on the lam. The letter, I tried to get her to send me the letter. She hid it so she wouldn't lose it and couldn't find it. Anyway, the letter, I've seen it, the letter is like a 3-page letter, handwritten in beautiful penmanship. He complains about he's only allowed to go out into the yard walking for about an hour, but he's reading a lot. He reads a lot, and he lists all the books that he's reading, all kinds of books. So Johnny was self-published, and Alison didn't like marketing. She liked the writing, but she did not like the marketing aspect. So after she started her second book, Ophelia's War series, she found a publisher, Gale Sungage. It's Sungage, and it's a division of Sungage, 5-star publishing, and they sell to libraries and schools. So Ophelia's War, the first one, is called Ophelia's War, The Secret Story of a Mormon Turned Madam. Well, we thought that would be a good title because it would sell well. It does pretty well throughout the country, but not in Utah. And you can imagine why. she even gets hate letters. So, Ophelia's War, the priceless ruby necklace secretly given to 15-year-old Ophelia Oatman by her dying mother isn't easily given away, nor is her virginity. But Ophelia must choose between them. The necklace becomes both Ophelia's ticket to freedom and shackles of shame. Fate, family legacy, hair color, the shape of her skull, sex, survival, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the tension between Mormons and Gentiles in the Utah Territory converge to shape her destiny. Ophelia's War chronicles the battles for love and survival fought by a young frontier girl in the 19th century. Her limited choices between polygamy and prostitution, the high cost of keeping her jewels, and the impossibility of protecting them. In an era when many women committed suicide so they wouldn't be shunned and faced the shame of being damaged goods, the rebellious and resilient Ophelia uses disgrace and the rubies of her room to reinvent herself and win financial freedom. Yet, what is the ultimate cost? Can love and reconciliation triumph over her loss and shame? So that's a summary. As I mentioned, that takes place in the 19th century, 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was joined from the west to the east in Ogden, Utah. So she says, and you may or may not be surprised at how this work or this story makes some people very uncomfortable and angry, especially in Utah, where polygamy is an accepted practice. Someone even said to her, "This book is full of lies." And she said, "Well, of course, it's fiction." And then she quotes Albert Camus, who said, "Fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth.
Very good.
So she continues, these two historical novels, Ophelia's War and Dangerous Mercy, required me to travel back to a time and place which by all accounts don't exist today. I completely immersed myself in research and stories of this era. But what most interested me was what was left out of history, things that were not reported. When I first moved to Ogden, Utah, I read an anecdote in a museum about a madam who had an ongoing dispute with the Mormon leader Brigham Young. She managed to purchase one of his gilded carriages when he fell on hard times after his 14th wife divorced him. And she paraded around the streets in the carriage to snub him after he had defamed her and had the authorities raid her establishment. And this is what inspired me to write Ophelia's War. After my brain was filled with research and history and documents from this time period, it was time to go to those ghost towns of Frisco, Grafton, and Silver Reef, which are all found in these two books. In Frisco, somewhere off Highway 50, there's an abandoned mining town where 10,000 people once lived and then left abruptly when the mine went bust. While I was there, trying to get a feel for the long past time and place, I put my hands in the dirt and pulled up shards of crockery, glass pieces of bottles, and elaborate light fixtures. Even a tiny mother-of-pearl button with two misshapen holes that oddly resembles two black holes colliding. They created a warp in space and time that flooded my imagination with images, stories, and voices. So who writes these stories? Do writers write these stories? Beyond the temporal limitation of time, space, and personal identity is a quantum field which sometimes opens us up to writing beyond our personal experiences. So about facts and research, these are the timeline, the places, and the historical events are factual. For example, Grafton is a real settlement. It's now a ghost town located outside of Zion National Park. And the events described on the first page of Dangerous Mercy are derived from historical records. Ophelia is a fictitious character, although many details of her life were taken from the journals of early pioneers. Many of the characters are loosely based on historical figures. For example, Charlie Siringo is a detective. Mr. G was an Asian running a gambling racket. Pearl and Belle London were madams. And Thomas Durant, who was actually the president of the Union Pacific and who was actually kidnapped by a band of unpaid rail workers. So just many years back, I found myself alone in the graveyard, waiting to meet someone who forgot to mention there was a very old graveyard at our meeting place. So I decided to begin this last book, Dangerous Mercy, in this location. For the most part, the work is fiction. Commenting on some of the dialogue in Ophelia's War, someone once said to me, "A woman would never have thought that way during that time period, or would never have said something like that in that time period." So she said, "I found it preposterous that anyone could make that presumption. Even though there are journals from the past, by and large, we don't know what people's deepest thoughts and feelings were, because anything controversial would not be committed to paper in those days. So until the quantum world and portals are discovered, we can only travel back in time through our imaginations." So that's all I'm going to say about Alison. And I'm going to talk a little bit now. So those are her three books, and they're available here. About Boston, My Blissful Winter, Memories of the 1980s. So now I've got another hat on. Now I'm Paulette Boudrot. So Boston, My Blissful Winter was written, the French was Boston Univers si court, was written by Alain Briotet, who was the Consul General of France in Boston in the 1980s. And at the time, I was working at the French consulate in the French Cultural Services, and that's how I met him. He loved Boston. And usually a consul general or anyone in the diplomatic corps has a appointment for 3 years. But he liked Boston so much, somehow he managed to extend it and was there for 5 years. From there, he went on to, hello. From there, he went on to become ambassador to Myanmar and to Finland and to many other areas all over the world. He wrote his book in 2007, and shortly after that, he was looking for a translator and asked me if I would translate the book. Well, I was running my business by then and just didn't have time to even think about translating or doing anything in that area. When we went to Paris, we would either meet him for a drink or have dinner with him or something. So when we were there in, I think it was either 2013 or 2014, and I had been retired for a few years by then, I asked him if he ever found a translator for his book. And he said, no. And I said, well, I'd like to try. I had a little bit more free time then. I said, I'd like to try translating it just to keep up my French language skills. He said, oh, good. He said, well, write the first chapter and send it to me. Which I did. I wrote the first chapter, sent it to him, and said, I like it. He said, continuez. So I did. And it was about that time that Alison had just published her first book, and I was helping her with marketing. So I started developing an interest in books and authors and writing and publishing in that whole field. So the book, Boston, My Blissful Winter, the book follows a young French banker experienced in Boston for the first time as an intern in a downtown bank in the 1980s. Now this is fiction. However, there's a lot that deals with reality. The author, Alain Dutet, was a young diplomat in Boston, experiencing Boston for the first time in the 1980s. So there are a lot of situations that I recognize in the book. Oh, I know that. So this young French banker, the fiction person, seeking to overcome his solitude, visits the city's concert halls, jazz clubs, businesses, museums, cafes, theaters, antique shops, fine restaurants, and local diners. He rubs elbows with Boston Brahmins, academics, a struggling musician, and a librarian, among others. With vivid images of winter and a keen eye for detail, these 12 stories, each chapter can be taken as a separate story. They're all linked, but they're separate stories, bring the unique character of the city to life and offer a glimpse into the heart and soul of the thoughtful narrator. So what are some of the differences between a translator and an author or a writer? Some of the things that I learned. Well, first of all, to be a writer, to be an author, you have to have an imagination. I have no imagination. So I just tell other people's stories. And in telling the story in translation, you have to, I wrote the first 4 chapters. I thought, oh, this is great. And he kept saying, now remember, he's not a native English speaker, but this is great, so I kept writing. And after 4 or 5 chapters, I found out that the Breadloaf, the writers' conference in Breadloaf was starting a translators' conference. So I applied, and I went, and I got into the workshop, into the advanced thing, and found out, well, gee, I didn't write literary translation, I wrote literal translation, and it was all wrong. And I had to change everything, especially the possessives. There are no possessives in French. Everything was of the this, of that, of this. I had to change all of that. Contractions, there are no contractions, and it was so formal. The professionals who kept reading saying, well, this is so formal. And I said, well, I have to maintain the voice of the author, and he was a formal person, but it still had to be changed. So in translation, you have to maintain the voice of the author and also the culture of the author, where the culture of the setting where it is. So that was one thing, and to explain that, I speak French. I'm almost bilingual. People ask me if I was in France I come from. That's the ultimate compliment.
Yes,
I love it. So, and I speak. My language, my thought process. I have 2 separate language tracks. So when I speak in French, I'm thinking in French. When I speak in English, I'm thinking in English, and they don't cross. So when I'm translating, it's maybe a little bit more difficult. I don't know if it's difficult. Anyway, I have to work on it, keep working on it, and then put it aside for a long time. And as a matter of fact, with this book, I put it aside for 2 years because I had other commitments. And then when I went back to it, I did not look at the French at all. I just looked at the English and read it from the English as an American speaking English, and had to do it that way. I have a friend who is both she speaks French and I had to, or I also learned I had to use readers. I went to the ALTA conference, the American Literary Translate, and they said, oh, do you have any readers? What are readers? Well, you have to have readers. Yeah. So then I discovered a lot of other areas. But this friend was a reader, and she said, oh, this is wonderful. She said, I'm reading English, but it sounds like French. Yeah. And so that was, again, the literal versus the literary translation. And the other thing about translating is in publishing. If you're an author, I think what you do is you write the whole manuscript and you send it out with a query letter to get it published. I had the whole thing written. Oh, I've got my whole manuscript translated here. If you're looking for a publisher for a translation, you write 20 pages or one chapter and you send it out to get a contract. You know? So it took me a while, you know, because I had to put it aside for a while. But finally found a publisher, and it will come out in 2020. So I'll just take a few minutes to read from one chapter, just a small segment from one chapter. This is from chapter 3, and it's called Feast of Kings. The young French banker is invited, and this is the setting, is invited to a traditional French dinner called La Fête des Rois, or the Feast of Kings. It takes place after Christmas, during the period of the Epiphany. The hostess, Madeleine, is a war bride who had been studying art and wanted to become a decorator and window designer when she met her American husband in Paris. The guests include neighbors, the Shays, and their daughter Susie. And the following is a discussion that takes place during the dinner. Madeleine, do you remember when you were moving and drove up with Paul with a trunk load of furniture? Asked Mr. Shay. Jean and I wanted to help, but when you discovered Jean was French, the two of you never stopped talking. You didn't even help us to unload the truck. Madeleine continued with a laugh. A few years ago, when the boys left for college, I started painting again to help with the expenses. I read an ad in the newspaper about a position for an esthetician to promote beauty products. And you could work in your own home. I lied a little, but since I knew colors very well, I was hired. I set up a small beauty salon in Jack's room. Jack was her son. The company that hired me, Hollywood Cosmetics, provided a special bed that tilted, 2 or 3 shelves where I displayed all types of jars, samples, and tubes of cream. Jack was furious when he came home. He couldn't find any of his things. It was a lot of work for very little income, especially when it started to get warm. I even had to buy a small refrigerator to put the products in because they would melt, and then I couldn't use them. My job was to clean the client's skin, apply makeup, and most of all, try to sell them the products afterwards. I also advised my clients on what color clothing they should choose. The company had given me a book I had to memorize. It gave color combinations according to the color of the person's eyes, hair, and skin tone. I had to sell shampoos, hair dyes, hairsprays also. It became very expensive for the clients, so they never returned. At the end of 1 year, I stopped. Paul thought it was not profitable. I miss it a bit. I like to chat with the clients, and they told me about their lives. Perhaps because she wanted to be gentle with Madeleine, Susie, the daughter, said, "You were too easy, Madeleine. You were giving away free makeup sessions to all the neighbors. You even did mine when I was graduating from Brandeis." Her mother interrupted and said, "You did wonderful work. It was difficult to make up a young girl, and poor Susie. She was so pale because she had spent months indoors preparing for her exams. With 2 or 3 strokes of your brush, you put some color into her cheeks and made her healthy again." Madeleine said, "But there were others who were not so happy," said Madeleine, bursting out laughing. One day, a man insulted me on the phone. He had given his wife a makeup session and color consultation for her birthday. And when she got home, she pulled all her clothes out of the closet and held them up to the light. The colors did not correspond to those I had advised. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. We'll reserve questions until after both authors have spoken, and then we'll ask questions after that. Our next author is Christina Lowry, and this is her bio information that she's written in first person. She says, I've written poetry since high school. I've written stories from age 10. She says, I studied Shakespeare in grad school, which is why I love iambic pentameter and in my poetry on the lilt of the sound of that rhythm. Treated as a newspaper reporter and editor, which gave me experience in writing under deadlines. I can't write without them and usually work best under pressure in a deadline looming in my near future. I've published haiku since 1974 in the US, Canada, England, and Japan. First poetry, a haiku prize, I got in 1976 and have consistently won prizes since then for haiku and poetry. At age 45, I returned to seminary at Boston University to be ordained as a United Methodist minister. I served the UM churches for 12 years before becoming a hospice chaplain in Rhode Island. Finally retired to Cape Cod 20 years ago, a longtime washershore who loves the ocean, waves, tropical storms, and backyard birds and animals. She says, as a member of 2 local poetry groups, the SCBWI National League of American Penwomen, I served 12 years on the national board, rising to its first vice president. National Haiku and Tonga Societies, etc. I volunteer as a chaplain at the Falmouth Hospital, secretary of the Upper Cape Chaplaincy Board, and I support numerous organizations like the Cape Cod Symphony and several ecological groups. I'll be speaking in collaboration with author and illustrator Elizabeth Mosian at Harwich, and I spent many months working together with her to produce the illustrations for this book right here. I have many comments and advice to artists that may be useful in working together on children's books. So I'm now turning you over to Christina Lowry.
I didn't realize I'd written all those words. I did not retire 20 years ago. I moved to the Cape 20 years ago. I'm not that old. Yet. It was the night before Christmas, and all through the ocean, not a creature was stirring. There was simply no motion. The skate cases were hung on the reef with care in hopes that Sea Santa soon would be there. Well, that's the way this book begins. And if you don't recognize it, it's a parallel to Clement Moore's book, The Night Before Christmas. And this book started way, way back in about 1974, 75, when my son had a bevy of pet lobsters. And my neighbor saw him walking these lobsters down the street one day, and I asked Brad about what was going on. And so this poem came from it. It's called Bradley's Lobsters, and this is where this whole book began. I have some pet lobsters that began with 1 or 2. Now I have 100. Whatever shall I do? They swim around my bathtub and use my cup to drink. My mom can't do her dishes when they're in the kitchen sink. Mom found her clothesline missing. When she went to hang the wash, she hollered to me, "Bradley, a problem, oh my gosh." So I went outside and told her in my strongest Braddon tone it was needed for a jump rope by the lobsters that I own. These are all stories that he told me about his lobsters. Sometimes in Mother's car, when we must slow down or pause, my lobsters need to catch up and hang on with their claws. One day, my little sister, while crawling on the floor, was nipped twice by a lobster beside the playroom door. "Kid's little finger's red," I said. "The lobster bit her hard." I gave my lobsters time out and set them in the yard. Sometimes in the dusk around our neighborhood, the lobsters take a walk and try hard to be good. I stretch my hand to hold them with the lobsters on a string. I stretch out my hand to hold the lobsters strong, as if I held 4 horses pulling a chariot along. They sleep beneath my bed and never make a peep. So I pray, God bless them every night before we sleep. Those were actually stories that he told me about his lobsters, and I tried to sell that many, many times from 74 all the way. Nobody was interested in it. Not at all. But from that came this book, and I can't remember how they transitioned into each other. But one night I was reading The Night Before Christmas by Clement Moore, and the lobsters just started coming into me. Instead of 'Twas the night before Christmas and all through the house. Suddenly it was all through the ocean, not a creature was stirring. There was simply no motion. I went, this is cool. So what I did was I set up Clement Moore's poem on the left on my computer, and I wrote the poem on my right, and followed it all the way through. So the book pretty much follows his, but it's quite different. And I have to say that the book is at least 50%, maybe more. The illustrator, who is Elizabeth Moissan, who is in Harwich, and a friend of mine, but some of the pictures are really unique and beautiful, the skate cases, and at the end they're all hanging up there. But this is one of my favorite pictures of the lobster Santa with the minnows pulling his sleigh. And the minnows, by the way, there are 8 minnows that are named, and they are all real names of minnows. There are over 100 minnows in the world. And so I went through 100 names and tried to pick out the best. The ones that kids would love the most and giggle the most at. Pea Cloud and Rose Red and a few others like that. Last week, Joe was talking about publishing, self-publishing. And he said it was very hard to market as a self-publisher. Now, this was published by Schiffer Publishing in Pennsylvania, who's a very, very well-known and wonderful publisher. And they have done a wonderful job. Do any of you get Cape Cod Life?
Yeah.
They put an ad in there, down in the bottom of the corner. They put the ad in there for me. However, I asked them to design an ad for me. Now, the Penn Women magazine that I was national vice president of, I put the ad in. They created the ad for me to go into this, and so I did some work too. Not only that, they send the books out to the publishing, to the different indie bookstores, but I have to set up all the book signings, and I have between the last weekend in October until the beginning of Christmas, I have almost 20 book signings I'm doing. But anyway, so publishers do things for you, but you also need to do things for yourself, and they will do things like ads that as an independent publisher you don't get. They've also sent the book to different contests, but then I also have looked up contests, a read aloud contest I've submitted it to, and they've submitted it to the American Book Association contest and several, and an illustrated contest. Caldecott they've sent it to. That's the artist one, isn't it? Caldecott is the artist one. So your self-publishing can do things. You can do things yourself, but the national publishers are much better. Of course, I started trying to market this book in 2004, and they accepted it in 2017, and it took 2 years to get published. So where you can publish a book in 6 months online or with one of your independent publishers, it takes a while. However, this is a really beautifully done book, and so is my first book, C is for Cape Cod. The editor, the displays, the way they put the pictures in, there's just one thing that I think is so clever on the tab, on the inside cover of the book, is a Christmas tree. That's something that I would never think of, and I don't think probably iUniverse would think about that either. But anyways, I was going to talk a little bit about working with an illustrator. Are any of you artists here? Yeah. Just one? Oh. It was while I got Schiffer accepted the words, and then they called me and said, "Do you know an artist?" And I said, "Well, I do. I have several friends that are artists, and I had been looking for about 2 years in SCBWI. That's Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and I went to their conferences in Springfield every year, and walked all around the illustrators and said, "Can you draw lobsters? Can you draw lobsters?" Can you draw? Nobody could. And one girl said, "Oh yeah, I can draw lobsters." And I said, "Just do one for me." And I went, "It doesn't look like a lobster." And when she took out a red pencil, I went, No, I'm sorry. And then Liz and I were at a Penn Women meeting, and I said to her, Liz, can you draw lobsters? And she said to me, I can draw anything. Send me the text and I'll do it. And this is what came up. And we talked a lot about lobsters and the colors of lobsters. And she started to make them brown, and I said, I kind of like to have them a little blue because that'll stand out a little more among the eelgrass and the sand and stuff. And so we both decided that red lobsters were absolutely not going to be in our book. And actually, I had ordered books from Schiffer, and they sent me the wrong book, and it was called Lobsters on the Loose. And it was about a little boy with lobsters, and he went to see lobsters in one of the cases, where you see all these lobsters piled on top of each other in the store. And the lobsters in the cases were red. And I choked when I saw that page, and I said, no. So, and the guy who wrote it was illustrated. It was from Pennsylvania. You would think that he would know red lobsters were only cooked lobsters. But anyway, so Elizabeth and I sat together. So I sent her the text, and she sent back to me a storyboard, which is the book is laid out in little tiny squares, and she drew little drawings of each one of the squares, and most of them are pretty much like the ones in the book. And she said, what do you think of these? And I said, I think they look great. And so the next thing she did was to take that storyboard and do drawings a little more detailed with watercolors, and so I could see the colors of them. And she sent those to me, and I looked at them, and we just went back and forth, and I said, the only criticism I really had was to make the sea Santa a little darker and deeper in color than the other lobsters, so he kind of stood out a little more. But one of the details that I love is at the very end of the book, there's two pictures of Mama Lobster, and she has eyelashes. She's eyelashes. And one's in the beginning of the book. It's while Mom did her claws and I read my book, we settled within our little cave nook, and there she is. She's got, I don't know if you can see the eyelashes, but she's got eyelashes on there, and she's doing her nails. And then at the end, when they've got them all, the final picture, she's got eyelashes here. One of the final pictures, she also, it's all of them with their little stars that were put in the skate cases. She also has eyelashes, and I thought that was a wonderful little detail that Elizabeth did that was just her clever way of doing it. And I didn't notice it till several readings of the book itself that I realized the eyelashes are big things. It's really cute. So you mentioned, Paulette, about writing and putting aside, and that's exactly what I did with this book, and I've done it with a lot of my poetry, and my Silverwood book has been put aside for a while, and I'm working on a Lucretia Coffin Mott suffragette book right now, but that'll probably go in a drawer for a while. But you write, and then it needs to be put aside. You need to put that writing aside and do something different because, and I don't know, you probably experienced this too, Terry. If you put it away and forget it and do something different, you come back with fresher eyes, and your beta readers do help. But even before the literary goes to the beta readers, I have this bottom drawer that has tons of manuscripts with paper clips on them, and I pull them out every once in a while. And this is what happened to the Lobsters Night Before Christmas. It went into the drawer. I sent it out, got rejected. I said, okay, reject, into the drawer. And it sat, and then I brought it back out again. And I didn't really do much revising after I worked with the original. And you could, if you want to come up here afterwards, you could take a look and see the revisions I have written in the text and how I did change it. But very little did I do after I had finished that all up. But it kept going in the drawer and coming out and going out to publishers and getting rejected and coming back. And suddenly I discovered Schiffer and sent it to them, and they loved it. And that's what happened. They accepted it. But it took 2 years to publish it. And during that time, Elizabeth and I are going back and forth, and we're going with the publishers. And what do you want to say? And give you your biography and give us a little quip. What do we want to put on the inside cover? What do we want to put in the advertising? How do we want to speak it and say it and stuff? So there's a lot of work that goes into working with the publishers. And Schiffer gave us a lot of creative liberty in working with them, which was really great. What else was I going to say? Most of the books that I've seen on lobsters have red lobsters, and I just choke every time I see them. Because we on Cape Cod know where red lobsters come out from. They come out of the pots. They don't come out of the store. And and of course here's my little red lobster here too. But he was cooked. He's a cooked lobster. But ours are blue. Or this is blue, but it's bluish or bluish green. But anyways, I don't know what else to say.
Okay, well, thank you, Christine.
Yeah.
Do any of you have questions for either of these two people here? Yes,
I have a question for each.
okay.
Let me start with the lobster lady. Did you have any difficulty with using Clement Moore's text as a parallel text to yours in terms of copyright and so on?
No, it's over 100 years old, so it is now in the general public, and I didn't have to get any permission anywhere.
Okay.
No.
The question I had for you is, did your French author, how did he assess whether or not the translation was accurate?
Oh, he thought it was good, but it really wasn't.
But he doesn't speak English, or
He
does?
speaks English. But he's not a native speaker of English.
I see.
So he would read the first draft and he'd make a few suggestions. But it really wasn't. The first draft was really not that good.
No first draft is there.
But he thought it was good because he's not a native English speaker. And so, also, that if you're translating, you can translate it into English or American English. And because this was going to be for an American audience, I had to put it into American English, so that was
That's interesting.
comfortable for American readers.
He was very patient. It took you a long time to come around to do it.
Oh well, if it didn't matter because it wasn't going to get done. Period. I mean, no one else offered to ask several people to do it. Nobody did it. And now he admits that he's written a second book, and I think the second book is about his father was a French officer and was captured as a prisoner of war during World War II. He didn't know his father until he was 6 years old. So the book is about his relationship with his father at the end of the war, about his father in the gulags, his mother who became the head of the family and took the family to southern France. So that has more. This is a nice book. It's fun. It's you enjoy. If you know Boston, you enjoy it, and it mentions Dukakis, if you remember that. Things that you're familiar with. It's a nice book, but the next book has more meat to it, which is they're both good in their own way.
Terry had interesting experience with her book in American versus English.
Mhm. Yeah, this is the British edition. Obviously, I'm American. I wrote my book in American. And then, unfortunately, because it's a British character, the British loved the book so much, and it was their nurse that I'd written about, and so they wanted me to write it also in British. And of course I said, we all speak English, what is the problem here? And they said, oh, no. So indeed, I had two British editors, and I British-sized the book. This is the British edition. I would have the American edition here, but I just sold 240 copies of it over this past weekend at the Boston Christmas Festival, and I ran out of American copies. So I brought in my British. It's the same story. So what's the difference? And that's what I get all the time. What is the difference? Well, the verbiage, for one thing. Jumpers are sweaters, lorries are trucks. It's the boot of the car, that kind of thing. There's a whole chapter in there of a typhoid epidemic, and I had them on army cots. No, you can't have them on army cots. I said, why can't I have them on army cots? Because cots are what babies sleep in. Okay, I'll put them on stretchers. No, you can't put them on stretchers. Why can't I put them on stretchers? Because stretchers have no feet. I went, all right, what have I got them on? And they said camp beds. I said, I have to say camp beds in that entire chapter? Yes, you do. So camp beds it is. And then, of course, the spelling, F-A-V-O-U-R, and the S's and the Z's are shifted, and they do something funny with their L's. So, but we also use the same words, we use them differently. If you ask any American what the difference is between steps and stairs, they just sort of stare at you and don't know what you're talking about. You ask any Brit the difference between steps and stairs, one is inside and one is outside. So in the book, of course, I use them interchangeably, but now I had to use them correctly for the British so they would know whether they were in the house or outside the house. So it is, it's interesting to do it, yeah.
It's interesting, there's a new Black Eagles jazz band, I don't know whether anybody knows about them, but the recently deceased horn player who was the spokesperson for that is British. And he always interrupted the concert by saying, "Now I'm going to speak to you in your native tongue." Being
That's
American.
good.
Okay,
Oh, that's
yeah.
very good, yeah.
I
Yes,
have a question for Paulette. You didn't say who is the publisher of the Boston My Blissful Winter, and how was the process of getting a publisher?
The publisher is,
Published.
the publisher is a small publisher in Georgia called PRA Publishing. And like every other author, I sent out, many queries and got rejects. But she called me, at the very beginning. And I looked her up online. I said, she's just a small publisher. So I kept trying. And she called me several times. And then I checked her bio and everything, found out she was a Rotarian. Well, I'm a Rotarian too. So that kind of bonded us together. And I was supposed to meet her in 2017 at the convention in Atlanta. Well, I got very sick. My husband was sick, and she could only stay one day, so we never met. So our communication has always been. And then I was very involved in Rotary for 2 years. I was the executive secretary to the district governor, so I had to put everything aside for 2 years. And then when she knew I was doing that, then she called me after the 2 years were up, which was last year. And by that time, I thought, well, what the heck? And by then I had gone to Alta and knew how to do contracts and negotiate contracts. So we negotiated a contract, and she has been very, the book's not out yet, but she has been fantastic as far as marketing. She made me do a marketing kit, and she's made me do, get all the reviews and translate the reviews, and she made me do an interview. She sent me, and my daughter's saying, you get more help out of her than I did out of this big publisher. So so far she's been very good with the marketing, and I'm up to the editing part now, so had a little issue with trying to use Google Docs, so if anyone knows anything about that.
No, and small publishers are very good, and they're much more personal. And I can call the president of Schiffer Company up and talk to him, and he's very willing to talk back. Something I wanted to say about the poetry, actually. A lot of children's books are written in poetry, and it's very important to make them good poetry, and some of them are not. The rhyme scheme needs to be consistent throughout. The rhyming needs to be pure and honest, not shadow rhymes but full, complete rhymes. And I was it was very important to me that everything was perfect in the rhyming, because reading poetry that is not well rhymed and doesn't have good cadence it grates on me. I don't know how it does on other readers, but it's really important to have good poetry in your book.
Yes.
Yep.
I wanted to ask about how is this going to work now? Does he have it already published in French?
Yes, it's been published in France in 2007, so the
Okay.
book is in the market. I don't know. But if you try to get it in French, it's like $38 or something like that, because it's out of France and
Right.
on Amazon. So used to be, you could get it for the regular price, but I don't know if you can get it in French anymore.
Okay, so it's been out there for a while.
It's been out there since 2007 in French.
Yeah. I didn't know if you were going to have to translate it back.
No, it's been out
I was
there.
like,
It's
oh,
been
God.
out in French since 2007. And another thing about the publisher was, I lost it. It's gone.
It'll come back.
It'll come back, yeah.
All right, Carolyn is going to wrap up our series here. We'll talk to you a little bit about Meet the Authors.
Yes, first I'd like everyone to give a hand to these ladies with profuse talents. This is the last
session we have with Meet the Authors. Hopefully, because it's been very successful, we've had a lot of input. Maybe we can continue this in the future. We do have a donation here, if anybody would care to show their appreciation. We currently, the Sandwich Arts Alliance, as you may be able to tell, is running its holidays boutique, and it'll be here from now until January 5th. So just come on by, do all your holiday shopping here, and we'd really appreciate that. We have a couple of raffles also going on. Let's see, was there, yes?
One thing I wanted to suggest, my name is Diane, is that we have to buy, if you're buying books now, you buy them through us.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
At the desk, right.
At the
Yes.
desk, yes, so, in past, we've had some people selling them direct and some people selling there, and it got very confusing,
Right.
so everybody that you want, get it signed, of course, and then, just purchase it at the desk.
Right, all the sales will go
Right,
through
and we'll
our
funnel
front
it that
desk.
way, and then it comes back.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So, and this evening, if anyone is interested, Dr. Bob Reese will be running our authors' networking session here tonight at 7 o'clock. We just get together and kind of chat about our writing and how we feel about it, and let go some of our
Not gonna be a-
anxieties.
Not gonna be a therapy session, but
Oh, shucks.
So thank you very much again for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.